Hey everyone, this is Andrew, and in this video I'm going to show you two awesome Kontakt libraries by the pretty new, or very new, Kontakt developer SquareSawSound. So these two libraries that I'm going to cover here are their two launch releases, and in terms of a launch release, they're absolutely incredible. In terms of instruments in their own right, they're also incredible. They're two of the top several synth libraries that I think exist for Kontakt. And what's so special about them is that SquareSawSound had two very rare instruments that they somehow got their hands on, apparently through a local music rental place, which is just like insane, because at least for me, there's no good rental places. But the two instruments are EMS, so there's the EMS Polysynthi and there's the EMS VC3, I think, or VC-SSS-3. So there's an insane attention to detail that's been put into these libraries. I think there's something like 11,000 samples between the two of them. Each one, I think there's over 10 gigabytes of sound total between the two. They broke things down into loop machine, which is kind of like looped patterns played on the raw instruments. Multi-samples, which just has a whole bunch of different sounds multi-sampled in Tritone Sampling, which is a very good, efficient sampling method, especially for synths without sacrificing sample quality. They did sound effects as well, so if you're into like crazy space noises, there's a ton of sound effect sounds. And then in terms of presets, there's a ton of presets. So if you want more information on the details of this, you click the link below to see my review, where I break down everything in much more detail, and you can actually see things written down where I can remember them. So first, let's dive into the VC-SSS-3, which is modeled off of this big monosynth by EMS. And overall, the first thing you look at is that the GUI is pretty clean. It looks pretty true to the original instrument, much more so in the other instrument, the Polysynth. But this one also maintains that similar vibe. The interface is broken down into like a preset page where you can pick the raw sound you're using. All the main controls like cutoff, amp envelope, filter envelope, there's tape saturation, glide, pitch envelope, and then you go into effects tab and you get a bunch of pretty much every common effect you'd want to add, and there is an arpeggiator section as well. So I'll just play, this is literally the stock sound once you open up the library. And the original instrument, I believe, was a monosynth, but of course it's Kontakt, so we can do polyphony, up to 32 voices, or you can crank this up if you want. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to start making some sound. So first of all, if you want to enable a filter, you click the switch, it goes to on. I want to use a low-pass filter. You can seamlessly blend between the different filter types. If you want, you can right-click on this and you can learn the CC. So if I do that again, here we go. Of course, you don't want to be doing that all the time, so we can put on a filter envelope. So I'll put the sustain up and I'll put some attack. So it sounds very good already, and this is just one of the raw sounds. So I can switch over to analog pad, make the sustain higher. And that's the raw sound. And this is kind of the beauty of the way that SquareSawSound has sampled these instruments, is that they give you all these raw sounds, and a ton of them. So they were able to capture a lot of the actual like analog warmth. They didn't just capture the oscillators and let Kontakt do all the work. They actually let the synth shine. And so that's one example of that. I'll go into one of the more wacky sounds. I'm not going to cover all of these. This video would be like 4 hours long if I did that. Reso filter. I actually open up the filter, you hear that that's baked into the sound. Let me put on some portamento. Nice. So let's dive into the effects tab for a sec. I'll put this sound to something a little more typical, I guess. Oh, I guess I'll stay up near the top and I'll just do analog pad 10. You can of course dial in some reverb. This is a convolution reverb, which has its own pluses and minuses. I'll do ghost fade. Killer. You can of course add delay, you can add rotary, bit crusher, chorus, phaser, flanger, compression, tube drive, back to the main page, tape saturation. So incredibly detailed. Now there are all these presets that you can load. They break things down to a lot of categories, and there's a ton of presets. This is one downside of this library, is that they save all the presets as NKIs, which is a little less efficient than using snapshots. There is an advantage to that, however. One advantage is that if you use snapshots, you have to inform your users in some way, or your customers in some way, that they have to move the snapshot folder to the correct location of the computer. This is not a licensed Kontakt library. It is a Kontakt full library, just like all of my personal releases. So, I'm relying on customers knowing how to like move folders around and put them in the right place, which is not the best thing from a customer's perspective. I do it because I think it's a much better way to do the presets, and once you learn how to do it, it takes like 30 seconds. So that's one advantage of using NKIs. You just give them the files. Downside, every time you switch presets, you have to reload everything. So if I click, I don't know, I'll do keys. Actually, no, I want to do pads. How about follow the light pads. So this is one point where it's going to show the loading time, because what happens is that they didn't break the NKIs up in terms of sound, so they just have the entire instrument in every single one of these NKIs. So every time you open it, you have to reload the entire instrument. Now, in this case, I did not batch resave the VC-SSS-3 because I wanted to show you this. So in terms of the SSS Polysynth, I already batch resaved it. And if you don't know, batch resaving is just a way of telling Kontakt to go through and just resave every single preset and every single sound in the entire collection, or whatever folder you tell it to. And it like drastically speeds up the loading time. I'll show you that shortly. So this is just a random preset. It sounds very cool. Now you get dozens upon dozens of presets, so I'm not going to go through that in too much detail. So I think this is a relatively good point to switch to the Polysynth. So if we go back into Instruments under SSS Polysynth, you'll have Loop Machine, Multi-Sample, and Sound Effects. So I'll start with Multi-Sample, and keep in mind the loading time when I open this. This is the batched resaved one. Pretty much instantaneous. So make sure to batch resave all Kontakt libraries. This is not a thing exclusive to SquareSawSound. This is just a Kontakt thing. Batch resaving is super fast. So this instrument is based off of the EMS Polysynthi, which is, I think, the instrument that was only produced in quantity 30 across the whole world. So it's an incredibly rare instrument. And that's just the raw sound. Nothing to cry about. But once you start morphing it and playing with the other more interesting sounds, it gets very powerful. So I'll stick with this main sound, turn on the filter, set it to low pass, bring this down, bring up the envelope. And bring up the sustain. Bring this down a bit. Bring up the attack. Bring up the release, and I'll also add some portamento and tape saturation, because why not? Very cool sound already. So now if we switch the oscillator to be one of the pad sounds. Sounds fantastic. Of course, you can go in and you can pick one of the more crazy sounds, like, how about soft vibrato? That's from the portamento, that wackiness, but it sounds cool. Yeah, so it's killer. This interface is much more original to the, or much more true to the original than the last one. I'll put a picture of that on screen. But, you know, very clean, very nice looking. Everything's organized nicely. You get this one-page kind of interface where you don't have to deal with the ugly Kontakt page interface that I often use. Put up some reverb. Put up some delay. There we go. Very easy to make an ambient soundscape with that. There we go. Couldn't make it stop. And that's, you know, I can go through all these sounds as much as I want. I'll do one more. Once again, you're getting that real, like, analog vintage instrument sound because they actually captured the raw analog vintage sound. And briefly, I'll go into loop machine and sound effects. So loop machine, as you might imagine, it's a recording of a bunch of loops done in the original instrument, which can be quite cool. It's not my favorite kind of thing, but it's there, and it's there in great quantity. It's 186 different sequences. You can do very cool stuff like that. I'll just browse through a couple of them real quick. So yeah, it's a cool thing. I'm not too much big into that. I'm not too big into the loop sequences. I think a lot of them sound kind of similar, but they are there in huge quantities, so you don't really have to worry about that because there's so many. Even if there's only like 50 good ones, you know, that's still a lot, at least to me. Now next we go into the sound effects, and this again is not something that I'm very much interested in, but it is there and it is very cool. Like, good luck trying to make those sounds in like just a Kontakt multi-sample instrument. You just can't. You really need the raw instrument there to pull it off. So I'll open up some of the presets. This one is one of my favorites that I played with, which is Fell to Earth. And again, you can't make that sound just by multi-sampling some oscillators and recreating it in Kontakt. You really need to capture that like raw sound from the instrument, you know, all the vintage analog goodness. So while I have this open, before I talk about my general impressions, I'll open up the interface, we'll look at the wave editor, I'll click a random sample, and if Kontakt doesn't freeze, so if I click any random sample and I look at this, they have loop points, so you get infinite sustains. Now if I hold a note and you just listen for a sec, in this case the sound is letting it, you know, it has an envelope, but point I was trying to make is that if you look at any of these samples, literally like any one, they all have perfect loop points. Every single one, across every single one I've looked at that has loops at least. So I asked SquareSawSound how they did this, if they had some way of automating it, because that would save me a lot of time if I could automate it. And they said they did all of them by hand. So already an incredible amount of time and care has gone into this library, but to do that by hand is just like nuts. Again, there's, you know, I think between the two libraries, something like 11,000 samples. So they had to do that for 11,000 samples. So absolutely insane. You know, props to them. Showing this here, you see the tritone sampling. The advantage of doing tritone sampling is that every sample never gets pitched up or down more than one note. So you get a very nice, pristine sound, but you don't do sampling of every note because it just blows up the size of your library by 3. So this would now be a 21 gigabyte instrument library instead of a 7 gigabyte instrument library. And for something like a synth, it really does not matter. If you're doing, you know, you're trying to make the world's best violin sample library, you want that detailed information, then yeah, you know, do every single note, multiple layers, different round robins. But for this, perfectly fine, great way to do it, saves a lot of space, and keeps the sound great, especially if you do the loop points perfect. So I think that just about covers it for the demo portion of this review. Now I'll get into the review portion of this review. So I already mentioned that I love these libraries, and I think they're some of the best Kontakt synthesizer libraries that are out on the market right now. One reason, incredibly rare instruments that you're never going to find in your store. So you can't really buy them. And I looked online, and I think for one of the EMS instruments, there was another sample instrument online for Kontakt. For, I think, the Polysynth, there was not. So you're getting kind of pretty much one-of-a-kind sounds, you know, sounds that only SquareSawSound can give you. So huge props for that. GUI is absolutely phenomenal. It's very nicely laid out, pretty true to the original, has a nice one-page interface. Inside pages, for effects, you can switch between pages like that. Color scheme's nice. The integrated sound selection tool is very nice. GUI, like, they did a great job. The sound recording, I already talked about that. They did tritone sampling, which is great. They had perfect loop points for every sample I checked. They have an absolute insane amount of raw sounds captured between both the libraries. You know, this applies to both of them. And, you know, they captured a lot of the raw analog goodness, but still captured the raw kind of standard waveform so that you had a ton of control in the library to sculpt your sound. If I had to break down the two libraries and which is good for what, the Polysynth is great for like ambient pads, key sounds, soundscapes, yeah, keys, pads, soundscapes, ambient stuff. The VC-SSS-3 is great for like low, gnarly bass sounds, but again, it is a synth, so you can pretty much make any sound on it. You can also make ambient, you can also make keys, you can also make pads. Preset navigation is one of the downsides of this library, so just make sure you do a batch resave. The loading times are very insignificant. If I just load on a preset here, with batch resaving, it is completely insignificant of a loading time. If I go to bass in the VC-SSS-3, that's a mouthful, and I load on that, it's going to keep going for the next minute. So make sure to batch resave. Very small downside of the library. To wrap this video up, I'll talk about who I think this library is for. I already mentioned I think it's one of the best synth libraries on the market, so honestly I think it's for everyone. You can make, you know, pads, bass, keys, ambient sounds, leads, whatever. It's essentially a it functions kind of like a synthesizer VST, but inside of Kontakt. The exception being with the more recorded sounds, you get a lot of that analog goodness that you could not get in a VST. So if you're interested, click the link below, head to their review page where you see more of the detailed information, the pricing, the gigabytes, the number of samples, etc., etc. Head over to SquareSawSound's website to check, their explanation of the instrument and the raw information from them, current pricing. So yeah, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, subscribe for more, and leave a comment if you have any questions. Click the link below to head over to my review, and also click the other link in the review to head over to SquareSawSound's website where you can actually purchase both these libraries. My total score of this, I think, is a phenomenal 5 out of 5. I think everyone can pick up this library and get it, so I highly recommend that you do. And at risk of talking for too much longer, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.